Hey everyone, J-Rob Plays here, and today's video is one I will make very often. While I'm a fan of Destiny lore, I usually stick to guide videos as helping others with the game is kind of my niche. But after watching a video from Bife titled Destiny Lore, Eyes and Tentacles, The Unknown Master of the Taken, It's Not the Winnower, with like a surprise bunch of question marks, I was kind of finally moved enough to leave a comment, hopefully nudging Bife in the right direction, at least the direction that I think the story may go, or the most interesting version of the story that I could think of. Since I at one point correctly called the story beat that would lead to the revelation that Maya Cinderesh was also in fact Lakshmi too, working behind the scenes, and I called that pretty early, even though I hadn't like made a ton of videos to lead up. I showed in the video how I saw that coming and kind of the lore that led up to that. I'm going to be doing kind of the same thing today, although we're going to be talking about this new entity that Bife has been referring to in the video, and finally he's kind of come to that point. Originally he was talking about how is the Winnower, and you'll see in my comment kind of my disdain for how Bungie handled the whole Winnower situation. Originally, I was hoping that the story would be more of like a kind of a gray and not what is right or wrong, but what is most important to like humanity. And the Winnower and the Witness at one point were the same being. They weren't actually two separate beings in the story when the story was originally told, back when the Winnower was first introduced. And you can see through the story beats how that's confirmed. And then later on, around the time that they were going to be developing the final shape, they decided, hey, what we can do, Bungie is going to retcon this and divest the Winnower from the Witness and separate these two beings. And they did that, I believe, so that there could be content going forward for future seasons. And I understand the reason behind it. I'm just a little sour on how they did that, because I always thought, as Bife would always refer to this Winnower being something separate or above the Witness, that, you know, it was just misinterpreted and the Witness is the Winnower. And again, I'm going to show that in context here going forward. And so now we have a situation where, based on, as you can see in my comment as well that I'll go over, that the Witness, the Winnower, and then maybe now something else has been kind of separated out. So I'm going to read my comment that I left Bife so that you can kind of understand where I'm coming from, and then we can pick up from there. So the comment that I have here up on the screen reads, I'm surprised that Bife has not connected this new Force/antagonist to Skira the Watcher. Skira was mentioned by Mithrax and Lucy by Savathun as well. This entity is clearly influenced by the Lovecraftian god Yog-Sothoth, which is also represented by tentacles and eyes or glowing orbs. I think that when Bungie retconned and separated the Winnower from the Witness, which I still believe is the same being at one point, to create new content for Frontiers and beyond, they also may have further taken this aspect of the Winnower Witness and created a third entity with these characteristics that also dwells in the deep, by the way. It's also quite possible this entity or the Winnower are one of the beings we know as the Nine. I had initially thought that the Nine came into consciousness during the clash of light and dark outside the Yangli Way, and were created alongside Mara Sov, but now the story seems to refer to them as much older and more primordial beings. We also know that there's two factions, one on our side and one who wishes to rid us from the universe. If I remember correctly, the numbers have been like 5463, with the higher number being the coalition moving against us. And actually, I found out later on that it's actually reversed. The 5 are on our side and the 4 are against us. Now, it's totally plausible that with the Rite of the Nine event, it'll also lead to a story tie-in revealing that one or more of the Nine can be using the void recreated by killing not only Oryx, but the Witness, to now make more overt movements to use these forces against us to their desired end. And I hope that Bungie actually pulls on some of these threads that they left out there from the past lore and expands on these stories to give them fulfilling conclusions. And so that got a couple of upvotes, and somebody happened to mention, shout out to this commenter, DempDog11. He says, wow, I think you need to make a video. I enjoyed your take. Good job. So I told him, yeah, I'm going to work on it, and this is the video that resulted from that. Now, what I originally thought would turn out to just be a short 15 to 20 minute video might end up being closer to like a short movie or a documentary on how we could be getting a new antagonist or group of antagonists on the level of Oryx and the Ascendant Hive, which is amazing. I was surprised at how my research took me down this rabbit hole, which was a good rabbit hole, but still it was like this crazy rabbit hole that tied so many of the threads together that I didn't know about before, having the desire to kind of put together a video that kind of shows the timeline and sequence of things. So since this video kind of took a turn to be a longer video, I'm going to try to break it up into as many segments as I can, and I'll even label those in the YouTube timeline so that way you can kind of consume them in little sections as you go, because I know not everybody's going to have the time to sit through an entire video like this. But if you kind of check it out in different segments, or maybe even like watch it like as a series, I'm sure it'll be satisfying as well to watch it that way. Let's start at the top with who I originally commented about, Skira the Watcher, and who Skira is, and how it can kind of turn into this entity that we're actually seeing on the Dreadnaught, and the kind of the motif that's being used, and the Lovecraftian way that this enemy is affecting us. And as you'll notice, when I mention Lovecraft, and when even Bife in his video to his credit mentions Eldritch Horror, you're going to see that that's actually a theme when we're talking these eyes and these tentacles that is going to really tie everything together. Not only the Skira, the Watcher that I mentioned, this being or this new entity, but the Nine and the way the story has gone, and even more characters in the past that either forgotten about or haven't been mentioned in some way or time. We're probably going to see those people in the future, and I hope so, because there are going to be so many aspects that kind of come together to lead this like really awesome background story that's going on, that Destiny can be told through, the lens of Destiny can be told through, and I hope Bungie does this. Who is Skira the Watcher? Skira the Watcher, according to Destinypedia, was an ancient foe of the Elixni who hunted them down before the arrival of the Great Machine, which would be the Traveler on Reese. Skira was a shapeshifter and manipulator who preyed on the fear of the Elixni, which made it powerful, much like Nezarec, for example. But once the Elixni ceased to be afraid of the shapeshifter, Skira to them ceased to exist. And so that's kind of the baseline in which we understand what Skira is, and I'm going to allow Mithrax to explain Skira in his words in this segment that we have from a past season.
Reflecting on our victories, I am reminded of an Elixni legend, one told by the scribes of House Judgment. Before the Great Machine, Elixni were hounded by Skira the Watcher, a shape-changer, manipulator.
Savathun?
No, but similar. A demon of our past, defeated.
How?
Not with weapons or words, but with silence. Our fear and belief made Skira powerful. When we ceased being afraid, Skira ceased to be.
Word only that simple, Mithrax.
I knew you'd be back. I'm so glad we get to talk. You and that charming little ghost of yours, you're not like the rest. You're not afraid of my words. Words are just thoughts given shape. Ideas emerging into the physical world, birthed by a mouth. Not good or evil, not light or dark, or this or that. And you understand, don't you? Despite the excruciatingly binary worldview of those around you. You don't have to say it. We've all heard it before. The line between light and dark is so very thin. As if you were incapable of lifting your eyes from a scroll of chalk on the ground. The traveler in the light near one foot, your old enemies and the darkness at the other. Let me tell you a secret. If you ever want to see what's been watching you since the very beginning, just stand on that line and look up.
And so again, in preparation for this video, I said to myself, okay, let me do a little bit of research on Skira and see what's even out there in the Destiny lore. And surprisingly, not a lot. If you go to Ishtar and you search for Skira, and by the way, ishtarcollective.net is a place where all the lore compendium has been put into a database that we can search based on keywords, and we can go through and read them by books or by entries. In this case, when I typed in Skira, I was absolutely surprised and like almost floored that there was only one entry, and that entry was actually Scavenger's Fate, the shotgun from the episode Revenant, which I didn't even know existed because I didn't play a whole lot of episode Revenant. I kind of tuned in for some of the story beats and went through the story, but I didn't really like grind the Tomb of Elders much, or I didn't really play a lot of the Onslaught activity because I'd already done that. So I played the original Tomb of Elders back in Destiny 1, and I'd already done Onslaught through Into the Light, so I just wasn't that into that season, and I missed this gun and entirely this lore tab, so I got a chance to first experience it as well, and I'm going to read it to you guys here. Go where scavengers fear to tread. Aura threw the datapad to the ground in fury. It bounced once, then settled against a crate of contraband scion weaponry. The screen continued to flash implacably. Connection lost. Reestablishing connection. Failed. Connection lost. There was nothing for it. He would have to break the noose to the spider. He found the crime boss at the bar, glad-handing with the bookie, in an oversized fur vest. They spoke in low tones before a subtle nod by both parties let Ara know that the deal had been closed. No doubt, a sizable adjustment to the Crucible betting odds would soon hit the tote boards. Ara gave a series of subtle clicks. Trouble, glimmer, loss. Ara could sense Spider's countenance sour beneath his helmet. The elder Elixir dismissed the oblivious human with a curt wave and headed wordlessly to the back room. Skira's Anus, what now? Another scab crew lost, the Spider. Ara replied. Iraq came under heavy fire in the reef. Went dark minutes later. That was the third this cycle, Spider fumed. Send a replacement crew. Heavy weapons this time. I want the nav system from Iraq's ship back. Spider turned to leave, but Ara felt compelled to stop him. But the Spider, he blurted. The crews, they won't go. Not until Fickrell is gone. They won't? Spider growled. That sounds an awful lot like mutiny. It's fear, Ara said, hunching his shoulders. They fear Fickrell more than the Spider. I could remedy that, Spider replied menacingly, but I can't afford to make any more examples. I didn't want word to get out about that sector, he lamented, but it hardly matters now. Time I called in a specialist. He picked up the fallen datapad and opened a comms channel. Welcome to my most lucrative customer. Now, don't you guys find it odd that in the entire history of Destiny, in the entire lore, that all of a sudden the season right before this season, right before we have these eyes and tentacles, that Skira's name is used in a curse word just as an aside? Like, why would they intentionally use that as a curse word? They could have put any words into this Elixir's mouth and it would have been just as meaningful or impactful. So why Skira? Why the one time you mentioned Skira right before episode Heresy releases? So that surprisingly would have turned me, if I was a lore master, onto Skira, and I'm surprised that didn't do so, for example, for Bife or anybody else. I have never seen a video recently done of Skira and the connection to Destiny and how it could be in this situation. I originally came across this because, again, I saw the eyes and I immediately thought of Yog-Sothoth. So I kind of want to talk about how Skira can be incorporated into Destiny's universe, and that's through the Destiny or Bungie interpretation of the old god Yog-Sothoth. Now, this old god was from Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft's pantheon. Just like Cthulhu and the other older gods, this god has its own domain, and Yog-Sothoth's domain is knowledge and all-knowing. So that entity right there alone kind of matches the idea of something who watches or something that just observes. He's also kind of the main force behind the Cthulhu mythos, or the kind of the outer god mythos created by H.P. Lovecraft, because he's the progenitor of Cthulhu. So he's like the father of all of these older gods and Eldritch horrors. And so it's not out of the question to take something like that and use that as a template for a new enemy, having something that's kind of above it all. And if you were trying to give the Witness and the Winnower a separation, this Elder God may be a precursor to even a Winnower, per se, if you're looking at something that is outside of all things. So we don't know where he lands in all of this. That's why in my comment I said maybe if we're talking about these primordial beings, maybe this Watcher is also one of the 9. And we're looking at these 9 beings that have this kind of like omnipresence within the solar system, and how they interact with the solar system is through dark matter. If you've paid attention to the lore, or you're a lore junkie like myself, you'll know that that's kind of where they end up living, is in between connections of all things. They're basically in all of us and in everything that's in the Destiny universe, and they can only watch for a time. They actually didn't even have the ability to communicate at one point, and they've been working on that steadily ever since coming into consciousness. Now that takes me back to originally the Yangli Way, because originally when the Yangli Way was mentioned, there was this ship manifest that showed that once the Awoken were in the distributary, and they kind of sectioned themselves off into these different groups that they ended up living with, one being with the queen and one being with Mara Sov, who was the real queen, but she didn't want that responsibility. One of those factions had 9 missing people from that manifest of that ship that they were using as kind of a main base in the distributary. So I thought to myself originally that these 9 were the consciousness of those people that got spread out to each of the planets in our solar system at the collision between the light and the dark. But if you're looking at Destiny lore now, and if you go through the Ishtar Collective and go through the lore timeline, it seems that Now it's being kind of retconned to show that the nine had existed at along the same times as our solar system and kind of were born with our solar system and are just now kind of making these strides to interact with us like they'd have with Xur, for example, or the Cocytus Gate, which we'll talk about as well further along in the story, and because they're trying to reach out and make this contact with us through those methods. So it's not also wholly unreasonable to think that maybe this entity could be an entity of the nine that is using this clash with the Echo and the spirit of the Navigator that is Oryx before Oryx changed, and is still adhering to that sword logic that the original version of Oryx, before some of the things that happened changed him and his decisions. They could also be using that break kind of into our reality through the throne world that has become manifest on the Dreadnaught to spread their tentacles out from inside of the deep where they live and through the Sea of Screams, kind of reaching out through all these gates that are appearing in these aversion anchors to try to evert themselves out into our reality as well, because they've done that before. The nine have done that before with the Cocytus Gate. And so there's a lot of these connections that you'll see and these things that kind of overlap with these stories. And one of those, again, is the angle of the Lovecraftian version of these nine, or at least the way that I would see them, kind of their own version of the Pantheon. So when you're running around through the Dreadnaught in the Nether and you encounter the mausoleum for the first time, you see this expanse of all these tentacles kind of going off into space. And even when you're going through the portals that lead you between some of the areas, when you're in the Sea of Screams, you'll see in the distance that those tentacles are still there, present in the kind of the ether, in that wind, that black wind that you see in the distance with the lightning striking. You can see the tentacles there too. So it's everywhere, not only physically on the Dreadnaught, but also kind of in that in-between world. And when you begin to fight these enemies, at some point you'll first encounter an eye that shows up in the sky, this big, huge eye with the slit for the middle. Now I'm going to show you a bit of artwork of Yog-Sothoth, and you tell me what you see. Looking at this artwork here, you can see that the art team for Bungie might have drawn from this particular artist rendering of Yog-Sothoth for those eyes, or just any other Yog-Sothoth rendering that they've seen. And you can see in these multiple examples, these ideas of these eyes with the single slit, with these tentacles. Even in this artwork, you can see here the idea of the portals that are seen in the Ascendant Plane. And these predate some of the expansions in which we are seeing some of these things. So the first artist rendering from 2014. This one here that you're seeing is from 2022, and the rest of these that I'll show kind of will be around that time frame. So if you're thinking about this idea of Skira the Watcher, of having something that is above all, with all of these eyes that are kind of inverting themselves and everting themselves in and out of our consciousness, in and out of our realm, that is also then interacting with this ascendant plane or the deep. You can see kind of that correlation now with this new entity that is now known as not the Winnower, and whatever we're going to be facing going forward. So I believe personally, again, based off this, that the entity that we are looking at, whatever they call it, whether it's Skira the Watcher or a new name, something that they're going to give as a new representation maybe of one of the nine, is definitely going to be influenced by Yog-Sothoth, by the knowledge, by the all-knowing, by the seeing. And it's not directly related specifically to Oryx. It's just so happened that the Echo landed on the Dreadnaught, which then brought about the spirit of Oryx, this navigator as we know him prior to him changing into, Oryx the Taken King. He just, in his mind, had defeated Akka and learned the ability to take. So everything that's happened after that no longer exists in this version of Oryx that we're seeing. It's only going to be the Oryx from before. The one had just been kind of fresh off of communing with the deep and taking the power for himself to become the true god of his race, the true god of, in his mind, the universe, the Taken King. Even Savathun in Season of the Lost mentioned something watching us. So before I go any further and I go deeper into this rabbit hole in connecting the Lovecraft universe with Destiny 2 and the Nine, Skira the Watcher, Oryx, all the things that are happening right now in the Dreadnaught with Heresy, I want to just address again the idea that this again is not the Winnower and obviously not the Witness, since we've already defeated the Witness. These references that have been made were originally one being. And so I want to first kind of establish that at one point in Destiny's lore, the Winnower and the Witness were the same thing, and it was meant to be that way. These were the mentions of the Witness leading up to the final shape. So these things that I'm going to be showing were made in the story a year or two before the final shape was even being produced. So these were the way that things were going to go in the lore. They were in the game. The voice actors already voiced everything, and the story was already told. And then they started working on the final shape, which then separated the Witness and the Winnower in the Salvation's Edge raid. That's the very first time we heard the Witness talk about the Winnower as not itself, and that was when originally Bife had his moment of, oh my god, I was right, the Winnower is something else, when really I think it was either a collaboration between Bife and the writing team, if they do talk to him on his suggestion to create that separation between the Witness and the Winnower for future storytelling, or they did it independently of Bife, but he was in the camp of the Witness is like below the Winnower, and the Winnower is essentially God above the Witness, just like the Traveler is kind of the God above the Guardians, and there's something separate. But then that would require the Guardian to have some entity above the Traveler. So the woman that was originally shown in Destiny 1 story, in Destiny 1's trailer, would have to then exist to counter this Winnower, and that's not something that we encountered in the final shape, and that's not something that's ever been discussed. So unless they're planning to take this woman that was originally supposed to be kind of the spirit within the Traveler and create this spirit inside of the veil that is the Winnower, or above the veil that is the Winnower, they have to kind of retcon all of this, and that's why I believe that they separated off the Winnower and the Witness so that they could have future content for anything beyond Frontiers if they haven't already done that in Frontiers. So here's going to be the scene in which we see the story of the Witness and how the Witness came to be.
Before you can confront the Witness, you must understand it. The Witness's first victims were once like you, struggling for survival, bolstered by hope, until their hopes became reality. They called it the Gardener, their deity of life. It ushered them into a golden age. For eons they prospered, but their newfound god never spoke to them. It lavished them with gifts, but not with guidance. And though they lived in paradise, they came to crave a greater purpose. They desired meaning, structure, a winnower, to shape the garden. Their scholars discovered that the Gardener shared a connection with another entity among the stars. They called it the Veil, and when they found it, they arrived to claim it. They already knew much about the light, how it could bend the laws of the universe and create life. But they came to realize that it could bring ruin just as easily. The cosmic events it set in motion could wipe out entire civilizations in a heartbeat, without reason. And so they saw the light, not as a source of prosperity, but of unfettered chaos. By studying the Veil, they came to know the darkness. A power that was shaped by thought and consciousness. And in the darkness, they found the means to carve away the chaos of existence, to calcify it into a final shape. Eternal and perfected. They brought the Veil back to the Gardener in an attempt to strengthen their connection. There, they could reshape reality itself. The Gardener would not allow it, and so it fled their world. But they would not be deterred. Having witnessed the truth in the darkness, they used its binding power to merge themselves into the salvation they craved. Thus began the Witness's pursuit. campaign to impose meaning on a meaningless universe. One that is nearly at its end.
So again, going back into this video, referring to the video you just watched, the race who became the witness labeled it the Gardener. You can see that in the video, meaning that the Gardener and the Winnower concept came from this race. So how could that be possible to have somebody label these things the Gardener and the Winnower, such as the Unveiling book did, if the Winnower already existed prior to the race who became the witness labeling the Traveler the Gardener? They actually gave it that label. They were the ones who desired structure and a Winnower, and they went looking for the veil, trying to merge it with the power of the light of the Traveler to shape the universe, which caused the Traveler to flee. And then that set up the entire events that led to the story of Destiny itself, to have this race then merge itself to become all powerful so that it can pursue the Traveler and meet its own desire, meet its own end of enacting this final shape of the universe. So the Winnower, if actually separate, would have had to predate this story of the flower game that was told in Unveiling, in the Unveiling lore book, and it would also have had to existed prior to the race who became the witness. So again, how do you square that in the lore that the race who became the witness is the one who labeled these two things, the Gardener and the Winnower, if the Winnower is the one talking in these lore books, which at the time I said were lies being told by the witness to throw us off, to try to manipulate us, for example. I never really subscribed to the lore book of the Unveiling because it was told from one perspective, and it was told in such a way that it was very manipulative, and it was trying to kind of get us over to its side. So now we can see that Bungie has truly retconned the Winnower to be separate from the witness with the lore that comes from the Salvation's Edge raid, showing that the witness itself is referring to the Winnower as a separate being. So they've also possibly retconned the darkness itself to be separate from the deep, because the darkness is the power of the witness. As you can see in the video, they describe that they picked up the power of the darkness from the veil, and then were using that power of quote-unquote the darkness to enact its final shape. And the deep, when you're looking at this new lore from Heresy with the deep, it doesn't seem like it's referring to the darkness. And if we're going to be skipping over the witness, assuming the witness is no longer the Winnower, and Oryx is now not talking to the witness, but something more primordial, something older or different than the witness, the deep may have its own powers and its own separate interactions with our universe. Just as the witness in its journey to chase down the Traveler cut out any of its personalities who disagreed with it, and disagreed with the means that it's going to be using to enact its own final shape, and then trap them in the statues that we see in the pyramid ships and also in the final shape campaign, the deep itself may have its own entities that are trapped within it, who've been imprisoned there for one reason or another, and I'll get into that. So this may be that third entity or force that I've mentioned in the comment I left on By's video too. So that now leads us back to the 9, and my research started with the lore entry The Witch, which is from the Book of Dust, brought to us in Season of the Drifter. Then the connections kind of happen from there. So I'll read this lore entry for you, and we'll go about breaking down the different characters and different segments, and how it all connects to today's events of Heresy and the Rite of 9 coming up. Came now the Traveler, and with it a strange hope, for the Traveler's light had the power to cause without causation. If the 9 had the light, they could see their own minds, free themselves from the dependence on matter life. They could gain forces beyond gravity to structure themselves, and so become more than wraiths of dark dust. They could enter the mad alien superworld of our chemical reality, so they turned to this new hope, and were divided. Come to me, a voice calls Lavinia, although there is nowhere to go, nothing to be, not even emptiness, but the absence of anything to be empty or full. Lavinia perceives without emotion that she now exists as a structure of dark dust, a sandstorm blowing against itself. Come, the voice calls. I am Nasia. You are not safe. Come with me. Not safe? No, of course she is not safe, because there are factions among the 9. One faction sent Zur and Orin to study Guardians in the Light, to seek the secret of effect without cause, and to protect the source of that secret, the last source, now that the Ahamkara are gone. Those 5 played at alchemy with the Kaitis gates, turning dark dust into energy and then into matter, but they could not unlock the secrets of our mad existence. They needed ambassadors, go-betweens. The other faction walks a different path, a path of folds and needles slipped through space-time itself, existential syringes yielding new spaces to be remade as the 9 desire. They have tried to gather enough dark dust in one place to form a black hole, and found it difficult. When the dark mass collapses in gravity's fist, the dust passes through itself and then scatters. But difficult is not impossible, and there is far, far more dark matter in the universe than bright. They will find a way to make new worlds of it. They will end their dependence on life and on the light of guardians, which the failing veil will soon snuff out forever. In passing, Lavinia sees the entire history of the Queen's interaction with the Nine. More than anyone suspected and more vital, she sees how one of the Nine blinded guardians to Gaul's approach, risking everything for Gaul, who would have destroyed the sun and the Nine with it, to learn how to steal the light. She now sees how that one was punished. Come, Nasya calls urgently. Come with me. Come quickly before. Something dark and hypodermic pierces the void beneath Lavinia and slurps her down, pulls her through a proboscis so tiny that it breaks her apart into a stream of single particles, one after another. She is annihilated and reborn. Somewhere, somewhen, made of flesh again, shaking and dripping fear sweat, mewling like a little baby. Her cheek presses against a warm wooden floor. There's a fireplace and a fire in it, and a strong wind outside that sucks at the flames. The clever-looking old lady at the desk looks up. Ah, she says, Lavinia, you made it. What? Lavinia gasps. What? She smiles as if Lavinia's confusion is the sweetest greeting she's ever heard. Don't be afraid. You've come exactly to the right place. Where? Some place where you're appreciated, where we can really use everything you've learned. The old lady pours a thin stream of tea into a cup of bone. Didn't I tell you that you were lucky, back when you were born? So from that entry, you can even see now the factions of the Nine, and even one who was punished. Could this punished entity be the one that we're dealing with now, imprisoned in the deep as punishment for helping hide the approach of Gaul and the Red Legion during the Red War? We also see that the numbers of the Nine stand at 5-4, like I mentioned in my comment. 5 are actually helping us, and 4 are working against us. And maybe that's only 3 now, that 1 has been punished in some way. Maybe they're no longer in that game of chess that we'll be working on going forward in the story. So we also have 3 other notable characters in this lore entry, and it's important that you know their stories a bit for context to the overall events that lead us into Heresy and beyond. One is Lavinia, one is Nasya, and one is the clever old lady. So let's begin with a quick overview of Lavinia, who in my opinion has the most potential to shape our future story with the Nine. So Lavinia's full name is Lavinia Garcia Moore Tawil. And that name is actually very important. You'd be surprised at the importance of that name later on when we talk about some of the ways that this ties into the Lovecraft lore. And it also kind of blew my mind. But going back into the Destiny side of things, she was a Cryptarch who was affiliated with the Last City. So obviously she worked with Rahul. And she was exiled from the Last City for her attempt to study the Nine. Rahul actually found her studying in the library of the Nine and going through some of the files that not everybody had access to. She kind of hacked her way into their archives, and he, along with Ikora and her Hidden, actually kind of put her on trial for these things that she did, kind of breaking into certain areas and asking questions that she shouldn't be, to kind of cover up any information from the public of the Nine. So it was pretty interesting to see, going back on things, the importance of the information that she was trying to discover and why everybody was trying to keep it on hold or keep it under wraps, because the only people who really knew about these bits of lore were, like I said, Ikora and her Hidden, Rahul, and the higher-ups in the city at the time they were running the city, before everything was then put in the hands of the Vanguard after the events with Lakshmi II and after New Monarchy and Dead Orbit pretty much abandoned the city. The Concordat as well has been kind of pretty much dissolved, and so now we have leadership-wise only the Vanguard. But at the time there was like a consortium of people who worked together to control the city, and they also controlled information, and that included information on the Nine. She risked herself so much that she was even imprisoned after her exile, because her exile led her to the Reef, which then led her to having a kind of a conversation, I think, with Skolas directly. From there she was broken out by somebody aligned with the Awoken, and then she was used and shown when she was accompanying this Awoken Paladin who broke her out on a show of force mission to the Leviathan, a device that they could use to kind of scan the dark matter of the universe. And from there, she was actually for the first time able to physically see with her own eyes proof that the Nine existed, not just kind of like in people's mind and as an idea, but very tangibly in the universe. She could see tendrils, which again, tendrils and tentacles are not far apart from each other, of dark energy intersecting with the Leviathan, as if it was trying to manipulate the Leviathan or to push the Leviathan, kind of trying to reach out and touch it, and then also by proxy to then reach out and touch Callus, because Callus was strong psychically. So that may be a reason why they were interested in Callus, and they were trying to then assert themselves on our world in that way. Now, this led to her being imprisoned again, because now she has information that was privileged to her that was not supposed to be given to her by order of the queen. It wasn't directly Mara that was ordering her to be imprisoned, but because Mara had basically put a gag order on this information, she was then imprisoned so that she couldn't tell somebody else of what she found, using tools that were developed by the Awoken and the Awoken Queen. And so from this state, she was then broken out again, and then she paid to have herself ferried over to the Cocytus Gate, and she was trying to interact with the Cocytus Gate because she found in the records that the Cocytus Gate was being used by the Nine at some point to try to create physical versions of themselves, or physical entities to kind of come over from their world of dark matter into our very real world. And those entities, both times that they were able to produce something physical, died immediately. So at one point, these gates were in control of Crota, but after we killed Crota and then Oryx and pretty much cut off all of their connection, it went back to the Nine, and the Nine then again were trying to use these gates to try to enter our world physically, or interact with our world physically. So she knew that this was the case. She was going through the information at this facility where the Cocytus Gate is, and then she was found by the Awoken, who had been tracking her since she broke out of prison that last time. And so instead of getting imprisoned and losing everything she found at this point, she made the conscious decision to say, even if it's going to destroy me, I'm going to go through this gate because I need to know where it goes. She goes through the gate, she becomes dark matter, and then she's able to interact with the Nine and find out who they are. And with that information, then she was getting ready to try to find a way back out to come to this world to try again to interact with the city and explain to them who the Nine are, because she believes that it was of grave importance that we knew who the Nine are and what their motivations were, and what they were trying to do with the Cocytus Gates and everything. And kind of Zur and his interactions with the Guardians are one of the main things that even led her down this rabbit hole. And so she just wanted to tell everybody about it and explain the situation and prove that she was not crazy, that the Nine not only exist, but they have sentience. They're not just that dark matter that's out in the universe, or the dust that happens to be the name of the book. A lot of the dealings with the Nine ends up kind of talking about dust and how dust works, because dark matter is seen in that way in this universe. And so she jumps into the gate, and then all of a sudden she is sucked out of that kind of existence of being dark matter. And in the lore entry, you see that she ends up in a room with a woman. Now that woman is pouring her a drink in a cup of bone. That cup of bone is mentioned or kind of loosely talked about, and the connection here leads people to believe that this woman who is sitting there, this witch in the lore entry, is actually either Savathun or Dul Incaru. Reason it could be Dul Incaru is because she's involved in the Dreaming City, and she was involved in the lore at that time. And then, of course, the reason why it's Savathun is because Savathun is Dul Incaru's mother. Dul Incaru and Savathun are related, so it could be either or both, right? They could be working in concert together, and it could be some avatar of Savathun working under the power of Dul Incaru. We don't know exactly, because it's never expanded upon. That's where the story of Lavinia ends. And so that really leaves a lot of potential going forward for Lavinia, because where did she go? The thought is that Lavinia is somehow in Savathun's throne world, or she could be somewhere where Dul Incaru is manipulating the space as well. But either way, she's in possession now of the Hive, and she's in possession of information that is only known to Lavinia. She's the only person that we know in Destiny's history, besides the Queen herself. The Queen has some dealings with the Nine, but she's the only one who's gone through that Cocytus Gate, become dark matter, and then from that dark matter has become back into our world. So even the Nine have to be interested in her, because she's done what the Nine couldn't do. The Nine couldn't come through that Cocytus Gate and become matter again, while she was sucked through this small, almost a black hole, into another version of reality, where now she has her body back whole again, and now she's in the presence of either Savathun or Dul Incaru. And we don't know what's going to happen with that, because there's been no mention of Savathun's movements or Dul Incaru's movements, although there is some possibly leaked information that we may see with this Rite of Nine, some type of a resolution of the Dreaming City arc. That's all I'll say. I don't want to get into that, because obviously it's leaked information. I don't want to spoil anything that's been out there. So the idea, though, is that now Lavinia, who has this knowledge of the Nine, with the Rite of the Nine coming up, is out there in the wild with Savathun or Dul Incaru, and can be a player in the story going forward. Now, having talked about the story of Lavinia briefly, let's also briefly touch on who Nasia is. I initially didn't know who Nasia was when I read the lore entry because it didn't ring a bell, but as I looked up the name in the lore, I find that Nasia is actually Orin. And Orin is somebody else that we know, and I'll go through that shortly here. So Orin was on that ship, the Yangli Wei, which I talked about in my comments. I was already kind of on the right path, known as Nasia Sarwar. Now, she was one of the first Awoken that were born after reawakening in the Distributary once the events of the Yangli Wei happened, and after she was born, she renamed herself Nasan Ar. She eventually meets with Sir Idu, who was also kind of missing. We've assumed that Sir Idu is dead, but there's been no real confirmation. And the connection here is that Mara Sov ends up meeting with Nasan R and seeing how she is good at mediating, creates a kind of a relationship with her as her mediator between the warring factions of the Awoken, kind of people vying for power shortly after they've come back into their being in the Distributary. And she was there whenever the Woken had their separation between the Awoken who live in the Dreaming City and the Distributary, and then the Woken who have gone on to live in the Reef. She was part of all of that. Now, with her, she ended up trying to become an advisor because of her curiosity to the people of the Earth that have left from the Reef to the Earth. And she asked Marsop for that permission, who then gave her that permission, but told her that if you do leave to become her emissary, that she can't come back because she won't be able to come back to the Reef. She won't be welcomed back since she's leaving their people essentially to become people with those on the Earth. She accepted the risk and she left for Earth, and she only made it a few weeks, unfortunately, before she was killed by a band of Risen who were scavenging. So she was killed by the early Guardians. Then, by chance, she happened to find that she awoke one day and she was in front of a ghost. So now she herself has become risen, and she named her ghost Gol, who then named her back Orin. So now she is Orin and no longer Nasan R. And this is how we come to know her earlier as Orin, because she kind of has that early story working with the Last City and working to kind of tame all the early risen and protect the people of the Earth. While in the Last City, she met with a gentleman named Namki who was an Awoken there, and he agreed to smuggle her back to the Reef because she was looking for answers on who she was, which she then met Marsov and had a memory of Marsov, and Mar was surprised too because the Awoken, even after being resurrected as a guardian, only really know like that they're related to people who look like them, but they don't have memory of them. So she was one of the few risen to have a instant memory when seeing somebody, and understood that she had left before and now she has come back. And so when that happened, she actually got Namki in trouble. He was in prison for some time, but he did so because he liked Orin and they actually got along, and Namki and her actually had a romance for some time after that. And she was sent back to Earth while he was imprisoned and talked to him every single day. Centuries later, she was then called in to basically pay in on her debt, because she, as part of her trial with Namki, agreed that she would just owe a debt to Mara, since she herself had no memories of who she was before. She couldn't really be held accountable for any of her actions before, and so the people that were there as part of her trial just said, let's just make sure that she's in debt to us and we'll use her later on. So in the meantime, what she did was she had spent time with Namki, and after he got out of prison, and then eventually one day after her adventures with Namki and her going around and trying to protect the people of Earth and discover things of who she was and going on her own little adventures with Namki, she ends up being called back because Queen Marasov wanted her to investigate the death of Sir Ido, and there was a little bit of a connection there because there was a strange coin found from Zur. Orin is the one who actually finds Zur, begins to interrogate Zur, gets so upset because Zur had information on Sir Ido, who was actually close to Orin in her dealings with the Awoken during the time in between her, coming back to Namki out of prison. They had many dealings with Sir, and Sir really didn't care about the law so much because she saw Orin as a good person. So that search led her to Zur. She's the one that actually ends up creating Zur's hump, the way that Zur is leaning forward by hitting him with her hammer, almost basically trying to kill Zur. And then Zur ends up answering her questions about the strange coin and about his connection with the Nine, which then turns her on to the Nine. So as she began to hunt for the Nine, she started to have like hallucinations, and she was experiencing synesthesia, where she was like seeing a color and thinking 9, or she would taste something and think 9. So she was kind of being haunted by 9. And while she was going through all of this, unfortunately, Namki died, and that left her in like a state of despair. During that time, she meets with the Drifter, who also has his own state of despair, going by the name of Wu Ming, and they kind of commiserate together and end up having a little bit of a relationship and kind of falling in love with each other until she actually finds out that the Drifter's name is not Wu Ming. She finds out that he's a Dredgen, that he's been different people in different times to different areas of the solar system, and she just feels like really lied to, that they've told each other all of these secrets, but he never told her who he really was. So she gets pissed off and she leaves him, and she goes on this trip, kind of a finality, to find the Nine, and doesn't care if she comes back or not. Even on the way out, she stops by the reef, and the Techians there, seeing her in her state, begin to call her Orin the Lost. So she finds out that there were some ghosts that disappeared, specifically 9 ghosts. They disappeared outside of the heliopause, and that kind of turned her on to the idea, okay, 9 ghosts, the 9, this is where they might be. She followed their trail out into the heliopause, and then from there, we never see her as Orin again. Orin will come back eventually, but we see her as an emissary of the 9, and she sets up the trials of the 9. That same emissary is going to come back for the right of the 9 that we'll be seeing here later on in Act 3. And so that's where the story for Orin kind of intersects, and that's why it's important to understand Orin's backstory and what she's doing in all of this and why she's involved in all this, because she is the emissary of the 9. So now we've talked about the 3 people that are involved in that story. Nasya being Orin, obviously Lavinia being the cryptarch that has the most information that's ever been discovered about the 9, and then Savathun / Dul Incaru, that witch. And as an aside in Lavinia's story, she was actually known as Lucky Lavinia. Reason being is that her mother told her upon her birth a witch showed up and named her Lucky Lavinia because she saw her future and she would be so lucky. And then that witch, at the very end of the witch lore tab, tells her, don't you remember I called you lucky? So that's insinuating that either Dul Incaru or Savathun, or both, very likely just Savathun, somehow was onto Lavinia through some means, as far as like trying to see kind of the future, or at least the threads of the future, using her Imbaru. She was able to somehow determine that Lavinia would be an important figure and then set Lavinia's life in motion. So she may even have been manipulating things behind Lavinia. One instance where Lavinia was seen holding an Ahamkara bone that she had stolen, trying to make a wish to find more information about the 9, also kind of reeks of Savathun's manipulation. It's possible that Savathun kind of set some mechanism in motion to have her get that bone, which then got her in trouble with the city, that kind of led to all of her exile. And so it seems like Savathun kind of just tipped a domino and then had that domino work out and was able to then save her with that information. And now Savathun has information on the 9 that we don't have, which also may play into the story of Heresy and how things have been manipulated on Oryx's ship. She may have been using information from Lavinia to free whatever 9 that we're talking about that could end up being this Watcher character that I've mentioned, to then also have this other entity present inside of the Dreadnaught. And of course, she wouldn't say that in front of us whenever she was confronting the Echo of the Navigator, Oryx, and her sister, who was also there, Ziva Arath. She wouldn't have just mentioned that. She would have kept that close to the vest. But that's possible that could somehow kick in Act 3, toward the end of Act 3, or it could be something that we see further on when we're in the Frontiers section of Destiny, which, again, now I'm looking forward to as I'm kind of going through all of this, and I'll explain even more why as we get into the connections now with this next section, showing Lovecraftian connections and the Lovecraftian horror behind everything, and how this all comes together. So now we can kind of start to connect the dots and kind of do that whole thing like Charlie from Sunny in Philadelphia with the board and all the threads. And we can say to ourselves, all right, so now that we have all the characters and players in all this, and we have all of these things laid out, now let's talk about how those were influenced and how the game itself has been influenced this whole time by Lovecraftian stories, and surprisingly from quite a long time ago, because again, the art that I showed you of Yog-Sothoth was from 2014, and that clearly, that kind of depiction of Yog-Sothoth is the influence for the eyes that we see floating inside of the Nether. And so we know that now Yog-Sothoth is tied into this, and the reason why we can really drive this home is because what I found out for the first time today, I did not know this. I was looking at Lavinia as a character and trying to figure out what Lavinia might look like, so I could kind of put together a little bit of art, so that way you could see her as we're talking with her story, you could see that art. And I saw her name, Lavinia Garcia Mortawil, And as I was searching for that, all of a sudden on Google, a few lines down from Lavinia's character herself, I see another story told by H.P. Lovecraft. And I'm looking at this like, how in the world is it possible that Lavinia exists in another story? And not only Lavinia, but Amur Tawil, her name itself is a reference for another character as that's part of the Lovecraftian mythos. So one of the big connectors here for me was Lavinia's name is actually the name of a character in the Lovecraft story, the Dunwich Horror, a story about Yog-Sothoth. And Lavinia is actually impregnated by Yog-Sothoth to create children that then go on to become versions of kind of minor gods themselves in the ethos, in the pantheon of H.P. Lovecraft. And so now you have not just one kind of possible tangible thing that you're looking at, where you're looking at eyes, you're looking at tentacles, and you're okay, that's Yog-Sothoth. But now you have a character named Lavinia who was in the story from all the way back in Season of the Drifter, who was tied to the Nine, now named Lavinia, tied to this Yog-Sothoth situation. On top of that, the last part of her name is a reference to a character named Amur Tawil. That's an entity that actually is a kind of a avatar of Yog-Sothoth who stands and guards or stands besides what they call the ultimate gate, like a Cocytus gate, for example, that people use to traverse into other realms and other realities. It's an area that accesses a place where time can be accessed all at the same time in the mythos and kind of the Lovecraft stories that have come beyond that. And that's expounded upon in Through the Gates of the Silver Key. Now, this story, Through the Gates of the Silver Key, was worked on after the original Silver Key story was put out, and it was kind of a sequel to that, like a direct sequel. In the events of the Silver Key, a man finds a silver key and then is transported in his mind to another planet. And the reason why the man looks for the silver key in the first place is because he's been having vivid dreams ever since he was a child, and as he became an adult, that imagination has kind of waned and his life had felt bland. So he remembered the silver key as a child and went back to his home in Dunwich. Again, a different story. Ends up finding the key, gets turned into a 10-year-old version of himself, and then that 10-year-old version ends up interacting with Yog-Sothoth through Amur Tawil, who sends him out to a planet that he was dreaming about in his dreams through this essentially ultimate gate. Well, that planet is called Yadith, and the description of the planet is it's a planet with many suns, with another basically a planet with a bunch of celestial bodies around it. They even have a description of a bunch of alien constellations. That planet sounds a lot like Fundament, which has 52 planets in that same area, kind of circling Fundament. That's kind of like one of the main staples of the story of Oryx and his sisters as they left Fundament, and then they went to conquer the areas around them and fighting all of these other races, like the Ammonites, for example. That particular planet, Yadith, get this, has a species on it named Duls. And I'm going to put a picture of this Dul on the video so you can see what I'm talking about. And what do you think when you see the picture? Because I can't think of anything but worm gods. And I'm going to be putting these several pictures of these Duls on the screen, and I thought to myself, wow, I can't believe that the worm gods, even the worm gods themselves, are Lovecraftian. And whoever designed the worm gods, the story behind it, they loved Lovecraft, and you can see the influence from these Duls on the work of Destiny 2 and on the story of the Hive, which is crazy. Furthermore, the Duls actually had a war with a native of that planet, and they conquered that planet, coming from the underneath. They were living under the surface, just like the worm gods were living under the water of Fundament, and then conquering that native race, just like the Hive, whenever they got revenge on the Krill, and they then conquered themselves, their own people, to then become the Hive, and then spread out into the universe from there. This story even covers how the worms get off of Fundament, for example. These Dul, they actually have the ability to get to faraway planets by swimming through space. Some of them even talk about traveling through interdimensional fabrics of dreams to reach distant places. So that sounds a lot like how the worms themselves can also travel through space, how the Leviathan, how Asa was able to travel through space. So even the way that these worms are able to move around through the Destiny universe are covered by the Duls, the gigantic worm-like burrowing horrors of the Lovecraftian mythos. So it's insane when you're starting to connect these dots and you're looking at it and you're like, okay, so Lavinia, Lovecraft, worm gods, Lovecraft. Like everything, even down to that race of the Krill, was somehow influenced by Lovecraft. So a lot of these things that we're seeing, these tentacles, these eyes, are kind of just coming home to the original roots of Destiny and how Destiny was originally just concepted in the first place, which is really cool when you think about it. So from all of that kind of coming to a head, we can speculate that this creature that we see that is not the Winnower, but is some aspect of the original powers of the Winnower that we're kind of dealing with on top of the Navigator, is going to have a really complex, layered story, in my opinion, that is going to possibly involve Lavinia from the season of the Drifter, who knows about the Nine, and it's also going to possibly involve the Emissary of the Nine. Now, the Emissary of the Nine, again, if we want to talk about the name of Lavinia, Umur at Tawil, that name is again an entity who stands beside the ultimate gate, like I mentioned before. I'm going to show you a picture of that entity in the Lovecraft wiki, and then I'm going to show you a picture also of that entity in Pathfinder, which is like a D&D version of the game, and how they depict this entity and how they kind of show that physical version of Yog-Sothoth in the real world. So I have these two next to each other. Now I'm going to show you a picture of a familiar person from our Destiny lore that we've seen quite a bit, and especially more if you are into PvP. That's right. Umur Atawil, which is Lavinia's last name, looks a lot like the Emissary of the Nine, which is Paladin Orin. So now we have this situation where you have the Hive, you have Zevroth, you have Savathun, you have Lavinia, Umar Tawil, and now you have this situation where the Emissary of the Nine is back for the right of the Nine, and that all completely connects everything together. You have this character in our Destiny universe that looks exactly like a Yog-Sothoth avatar. You have this new being that is assaulting us with eyes that look exactly like Yog-Sothoth, with tentacles that really, really evoke an old god Yog-Sothoth type of aesthetic. And as like a lore junkie or somebody who just enjoys good stories, how can you look at all of these things that connect themselves and say this is not meant to be this way? The fact that we only have one lore entry that addresses Skira the Watcher, actually lore entry and not necessarily just an aside as part of a activity that we did years ago. And that lore entry just happened to come to us last season, a season that not a whole lot of people played, but a season that predates Heresy. So we have all of this Lovecraftian connection. We have all of these characters that are connecting. Everything is super lined up for some type of cosmic force or some type of eldritch being, as Bife mentioned in his video, to be an antagonist in the future, if not in Act 3 of this particular episode. In the future, once we get through a couple of these smaller building stories of Frontiers, we may actually not only handle Xivu Arath as kind of a final bookend, but we may have something above the pantheon of the Hive, above Oryx, Xivu, and Savathun, that is very similar to like an old god, or even a pantheon of old gods with the 9, the 5, and the 4, who are very similar to the gods that you would have conquered if you played World of Warcraft. In World of Warcraft, you have Yogg-Saron, you have a Cthulhu god, very similar, which is Cthulhu. You have so many different gods. N'Zoth is another one. You have the city of R'lyeh. Like, you have all of these things that are tied together through a Lovecraftian mythos, and now we might have that exact same thing inside of Destiny, which to me, it was absolutely amazing to discover that the story of Destiny 2 may just be layered on top of the bones of a Lovecraft-like universe, much like Oryx Throne World has been layered on top of the bones of Akka. So this brings out so much more possibility for the future of Destiny 2, especially if the writers that are left at the company lean into this Lovecraftian ethos even more going forward. This could lead to new enemies and races that don't even operate within the same laws of physics that our current enemies do, much like how our paracausal powers allow us to change the laws of nature around us and even weaponize it. This could lead to even more new game mechanics like the suffocating terror that augment our fights across the new areas of engagement, and that leaves me optimistic about what the future holds for the game at a time when I was so close to walking away from the game entirely, like many other Destiny 1 veterans have already done. Even to the fact that there was a comment that stood out to me as well under Bife's video that talked about how they saw the idea of having to kneel before these eyes to remove the suffocating terror buff, and how that's kind of tied into like entity trying to subjugate us. One thing that of note to that is that not only can you look down, but you can also turn your back to the eyes and the suffocating terror will fall off, which again ties right back to Skira, eventually saying, if I just ignore you, you don't have any effect on me anymore. So that's what really kind of drove home to me that we may be dealing with that type of an entity. Skira popped in mind exactly for that reason, and so I'm excited again where things are going to go with the franchise. If you made it this far into the video, I hope it instills the same excitement and optimism in you as it did for me when I was researching and making this video. If you got any additional input or ideas that popped into your head while watching this video, please leave me a comment down below. Maybe it'll lead to like another awesome lore rabbit hole that we can explore as a community in a future video. But thank you again for watching this video. I know it was a long watch, and I appreciate everybody that's made it to the end, even if you did it in segments, because it was a lot of information to get out, and I couldn't find a way to kind of separate that out and not have that same punch as tying it all together in the end like we just did. And I hope it kind of blew your mind the same way it blew my mind. And again, I'm a lore junkie, and I had no idea about the connections in the Lovecraft universe and the way that things are being crafted. And I really hope that maybe even somebody at Bungie happens to see this video and gets a kick out of it, because they're like, you know, we knew the whole time and we love doing it too. So I'll see you guys in the next video, and I appreciate again all of your continued support. And thanks again to all my subscribers for my most recent videos. I want to make sure to touch on that too. We're almost at 2,000 subscribers, so I appreciate everybody, and I look forward to the future story that Destiny tells and seeing you guys enjoy it alongside me as well.